Your soulmate is preparing to return to your life, but there's a problem. There are moments in life that seem ordinary until you look back and realize they were quietly changing everything. If these words have found you today, don't rush past them. Sometimes we spend so much time looking for answers in the future that we fail to notice the small changes already happening around us. Somewhere, there is a person who has been carrying thoughts they never expected to carry. For a long time they believed the chapter between you had already come to an end. They convinced themselves that moving forward was the only reasonable choice. They buried old conversations beneath busy schedules, replaced unanswered questions with routine, and told themselves that silence was proof the connection no longer mattered. Yet life has an unusual way of bringing unfinished emotions back into the light when people least expect it. Over the past few days, something inside them has begun to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost unnoticed at first. It began with small moments. A familiar song that unexpectedly reminded them of you. A place they had not visited in months that suddenly brought back a memory they thought had disappeared forever. A conversation with someone else that somehow led their thoughts back to your name. They tried to dismiss those moments as coincidence, but the pattern continued. Every attempt to move their attention elsewhere somehow circled back to you. At first they found it frustrating because they believed they had already made peace with the past. But the more they tried to ignore what was happening, the clearer one truth became. They had never truly stopped caring. They had simply become very good at pretending they had. That realization stayed with them long after the moment passed. It followed them into quiet evenings, into long walks, into ordinary mornings where nothing looked different on the outside, yet everything felt different within. They began asking themselves questions they had carefully avoided for months. Why does this person still matter to me? Why do I remember the smallest details about them when I struggle to remember yesterday's conversations? Why does every attempt to move on feel incomplete? These were uncomfortable questions because honest answers often require people to admit things pride has kept hidden for far too long. Slowly, they stopped arguing with those feelings. Instead of pushing the memories away, they allowed themselves to sit with them. And something unexpected happened. The memories no longer felt painful. They felt meaningful. They remembered the kindness you showed without asking for recognition. They remembered the moments when you listened without trying to fix everything. They remembered how easy it felt to be themselves around you. Those memories reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. Genuine connection is rare. It cannot be forced, copied, or replaced simply because time has passed. The realization brought both comfort and uncertainty because it led to another question they could no longer ignore. If the connection still feels this real, then why has nothing changed? That is where the problem begins. Returning is no longer the difficult part. Their heart has already started moving in your direction. The real obstacle lies somewhere else. It has nothing to do with distance alone, and it has nothing to do with a lack of feeling. The obstacle is the weight of everything left unsaid. They worry that too much time has passed. They wonder whether you have already built a completely different life. They question whether reaching out now would reopen old wounds instead of creating new possibilities. Every hopeful thought is followed by another cautious one. What if they are too late? What if the silence has already changed everything? What if the person they have been thinking about no longer wants to hear from them? These questions keep returning because fear rarely disappears the moment someone becomes honest. Honesty often reveals fear before it reveals courage. Yet despite those doubts, something continues pulling them forward. Every day they delay speaking feels heavier than the day before. They notice themselves reaching for their phone without realizing it. They find themselves scrolling through old conversations before stopping halfway, unsure whether to continue. They think about writing a message, only to erase the words before they are finished. Not because they no longer care, but because they care enough to worry about saying the wrong thing. They understand that one message cannot erase months of silence. One conversation cannot instantly rebuild trust. They know that if they return, they must return honestly, not pretending nothing happened, not expecting everything to be exactly as it once was, but accepting that meaningful relationships require courage as much as they require affection. That understanding has changed them. They no longer dream about perfect outcomes. Instead, they hope for one genuine conversation where neither person feels the need to hide behind pride or assumptions. While all of this has been unfolding inside their heart, something else has quietly changed. They have begun seeing their own mistakes more clearly. It is easier to blame circumstances than to admit fear influenced important decisions. Looking back, they recognize moments when they could have spoken but chose silence. They remember opportunities that passed because they kept waiting for certainty before taking a step. Now they realize certainty rarely arrives first. Most meaningful decisions begin with uncertainty, and only later reveal whether they were the right ones. That realization has made them more compassionate, not only toward themselves but toward you as well. They understand that perhaps you were carrying your own fears, your own unanswered questions, your own reasons for staying quiet. Suddenly the story no longer feels like one person walked away while the other waited. It feels like two people standing on opposite sides of the same uncertainty, each believing the other had already moved on. This thought stays with them because it changes everything. Instead of feeling defeated, they begin feeling hopeful. Misunderstandings can sometimes be untangled. Silence can sometimes be broken. But only if someone is willing to take the first honest step. Even with that growing hope, the problem remains. They are preparing themselves emotionally to return, yet they keep asking whether they deserve that chance. They wonder whether apologies will be enough. They wonder whether trust can be rebuilt slowly, one conversation at a time. More than anything, they wonder whether you would even be willing to listen. Those questions have no easy answers, but they are no longer reasons to give up. They have become reasons to grow. Each day they become a little more certain that avoiding the truth has already cost them enough. Whatever happens next, they do not want another season of life to pass wondering what might have happened if they had simply been brave. Somewhere between remembering the past and imagining the future, they have reached a quiet decision. They cannot promise perfect words. They cannot promise perfect timing. But they are slowly becoming the kind of person who is willing to choose honesty over fear. The journey back has already begun inside their heart. The only thing standing between where they are now and the conversation they long to have is one final wall built from doubt, regret, and uncertainty. And as each new day passes, that wall grows a little weaker than it was the day before. They never imagined that returning could feel more difficult than walking away. For so long they believed that if the day ever came when they wanted to reconnect, everything would become simple. They thought the hardest part would be admitting that they still cared. But after finally accepting those feelings, they discovered something far more challenging. The heart can decide in a single moment, yet the mind keeps asking questions that have no immediate answers. Every time they imagined reaching out to you, another thought quietly interrupted. What if too much has changed? What if they have already accepted life without me? What if my silence spoke louder than my feelings ever could? Those questions stayed with them from morning until night, following them through ordinary routines and quiet moments alike. They tried convincing themselves that perhaps leaving everything untouched would be easier for both of you. After all, people often say time heals everything. But deep inside they knew time had not erased this connection. It had only revealed how genuine it truly was. If the feelings had been temporary, they would have disappeared long ago. Instead, they had grown quieter, deeper, and impossible to ignore. That realization forced them to look at the past with new eyes. They stopped remembering only the happy moments and began remembering the moments where fear quietly changed the direction of everything. They remembered conversations that ended too soon because neither of you said what was really on your mind. They remembered opportunities to ask one more question, to stay a little longer, to explain instead of assuming. Looking back, they realized how many important moments had been shaped not by a lack of affection but by uncertainty. They had believed they were protecting themselves, yet now they understood they had also been protecting themselves from the very happiness they wanted most. Throughout the day they found themselves watching people around them more carefully. Couples talking over coffee. Friends laughing without worrying about saying the perfect thing. Families walking together without pretending everything was perfect. Those ordinary scenes made them think about something they had never fully appreciated before. Every meaningful relationship survives because someone eventually chooses honesty over fear. No lasting connection is built on perfect timing. It is built on people deciding that the truth matters more than the possibility of rejection. That thought stayed with them as they continued through their day. It did not erase their doubts, but it made those doubts feel smaller than they had before. Later that afternoon they found themselves returning to a place they had not visited in a long time. It was not a place that held dramatic memories. It was ordinary, almost forgettable to anyone else. Yet standing there brought back a feeling they could not explain. They remembered one simple conversation the two of you once shared. At the time it had seemed completely normal, just another exchange between two people. But now they understood why that memory refused to disappear. It was one of the few moments in their life where they had felt completely accepted without needing to prove anything. They realized they had spent years searching for that feeling in other places, never understanding that it had already existed once before. They stood there longer than they intended, quietly smiling to themselves, wondering how something so ordinary could remain so meaningful after all this time. As evening approached, another truth became impossible to ignore. They were no longer afraid of their feelings. They were afraid of the possibility that you might never know about them. There is a significant difference between those two fears. The first keeps people silent. The second pushes them toward courage. They began imagining what your perspective might have been all this time. Perhaps you had your own reasons for stepping back. Perhaps you had waited for them to make the first move before eventually deciding to protect your own peace. Perhaps you had interpreted their silence as indifference when, in reality, it had been uncertainty. The more they considered your side of the story, the less interested they became in blaming the past. Instead, they became interested in understanding it. Understanding creates compassion, and compassion often opens doors that pride keeps locked. That evening they opened their phone once again. They did not type anything immediately. Instead, they simply looked at your name and allowed themselves to feel everything they had spent so long avoiding. Surprisingly, there was no panic anymore. There was only gratitude mixed with quiet hope. Gratitude because meeting you had changed the way they understood genuine connection. Hope because they finally believed that unfinished conversations do not always have to remain unfinished forever. They knew one message could not instantly repair months of distance. They knew trust grows slowly, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. But they also understood something equally important. Nothing can begin until someone is willing to take the first honest step. As night settled once again, they asked themselves one final question. If fear were removed completely, what would I do? The answer arrived more quickly than they expected. They would reach out. They would stop pretending the connection had disappeared. They would admit that life had taught them many lessons during the time apart, but the greatest lesson was discovering the difference between protecting the heart and imprisoning it. They had spent too long inside emotional walls they built themselves. Now those walls no longer felt like protection. They felt like barriers separating them from something that still mattered. Even with that growing clarity, the problem had not disappeared entirely. It had simply changed shape. The obstacle was no longer whether they wanted to return. They already knew the answer to that. The obstacle was believing they deserved the opportunity to return after so much silence. That thought stayed with them as they looked out into the quiet night. Yet somewhere beneath every doubt, another voice had become stronger. It reminded them that everyone makes mistakes, everyone allows fear to influence important decisions, and everyone reaches moments where they wish they had spoken sooner. The past could not be rewritten, but the future had not been written yet. That simple realization became the source of a courage they had never felt before. Slowly, almost without noticing, they stopped focusing on whether everything would work out perfectly. Instead, they focused on becoming someone who would never again allow unspoken feelings to become lifelong regrets. And as they prepared for another day, they carried one quiet promise inside their heart. The next time life placed an opportunity in front of them, they would not let silence speak on their behalf. They would choose honesty, even if their voice trembled, because some people are simply too important to lose to fear alone. As another day slowly unfolded, they noticed something they had never paid attention to before. The world around them had not changed, yet they were experiencing it differently. Familiar streets seemed quieter. Ordinary conversations felt shorter. Even the busiest moments of the day could not completely distract them from the thoughts that had quietly settled inside their heart. It was as though they had been moving through life on autopilot for a very long time, and only now were they beginning to wake up. They no longer saw your memory as something they needed to escape. Instead, they began seeing it as a reminder of the person they had once been whenever they felt completely understood. That realization stayed with them from the moment they woke until the evening arrived. They found themselves wondering why people often wait until distance teaches them the value of someone's presence. Perhaps it is because certainty rarely exists while a connection is still close. It is only after silence settles in that the smallest moments begin revealing how important they truly were. They remembered the conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but now felt unforgettable. They remembered how naturally the two of you could speak about almost anything without trying to impress one another. There had never been a need to pretend. There had never been a need to wear a mask. Looking back, they understood that those simple moments were far more valuable than they had ever realized. Since then they had met many people, shared countless conversations, and experienced many different situations, yet something always felt incomplete. It was not because those people lacked kindness. It was because genuine comfort cannot be recreated by simply replacing one person with another. Every connection has its own rhythm, its own language, its own quiet way of making someone feel seen. What existed between you had never been loud or dramatic. It had been calm, honest, and unexpectedly meaningful. That was precisely why it had remained alive in their memory for so long. As they continued through the afternoon, they caught themselves imagining how life might have unfolded if fear had never entered the picture. Not because they wanted to live in the past, but because they were finally able to recognize the moments where uncertainty quietly took control. They remembered waiting for the perfect opportunity to say something important. They remembered convincing themselves there would always be another chance. They remembered believing that if the connection was truly real, it would somehow take care of itself without requiring courage. Now they understood how mistaken that belief had been. Meaningful relationships do not survive because people remain silent. They survive because, sooner or later, someone decides that honesty is worth the risk. This thought stayed with them as the sun slowly disappeared below the horizon. For the first time, they stopped asking whether reaching out would guarantee the outcome they hoped for. Instead, they asked themselves a different question. If I never try, will I regret this years from now? The answer arrived without hesitation. Yes. That simple answer carried more weight than any fear they had been holding on to. Regret suddenly seemed far heavier than rejection. At least honesty offers peace. Silence only keeps creating questions that never disappear. As evening settled, they opened an old photo gallery on their phone, not because they wanted to remain trapped in the past but because they wanted to understand why certain memories still carried so much emotion. They smiled softly as they remembered the ordinary moments rather than the extraordinary ones. A brief conversation. A shared joke. A simple glance across the room. Those memories reminded them that genuine affection is rarely built from dramatic events. It grows through consistency, trust, and countless little moments that seem insignificant until they are gone. The more they reflected, the more they understood that what they missed most was not simply your presence. They missed the version of themselves that existed whenever you were around. Around you they felt lighter, calmer, and less afraid of being misunderstood. That feeling had become increasingly difficult to find anywhere else. They realized they had spent too much time searching for certainty when what they truly needed was courage. That understanding quietly changed the way they looked at the future. They no longer imagined returning to your life expecting everything to be exactly as it once was. Life changes people. Time changes perspectives. Experiences leave marks on every heart. They accepted that both of you had likely grown in different ways during the time apart. Yet growth did not erase what had once been real. If anything, it helped them appreciate it even more. They found comfort in believing that honest conversations do not require perfect circumstances. They only require two people willing to stop hiding behind assumptions. That thought stayed with them long into the night. They looked out the window, watching lights glow in the distance, and quietly admitted something they had never been brave enough to say before. They were no longer preparing to return because they were lonely. They were preparing to return because they finally understood the difference between temporary comfort and lasting connection. Loneliness fades when people are around. Real connection stays with you even when they are not. That was the truth they could no longer deny. Still, one final obstacle remained. It was not your reaction. It was not the distance. It was forgiving themselves for waiting so long. They carried guilt for every opportunity they had allowed to pass. They wondered whether courage would have changed everything if it had arrived sooner. But after sitting with those thoughts for a long time, they reached another quiet realization. They could spend forever wishing the past had been different, or they could become the person they wished they had been all along. The past could teach them, but it could not hold them prisoner unless they allowed it to. That realization felt like the first real step toward freedom. Before the night ended, they made one silent promise that nobody else would ever hear. If life placed even the smallest opportunity in front of them, they would no longer hesitate because of fear. They would not allow pride to speak louder than sincerity. They would not let another season pass believing someone else should always make the first move. They understood that some chances only appear once, and when they do, they deserve honesty rather than hesitation. As they closed their eyes that evening, there was still uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring, but there was no longer uncertainty about what their heart wanted. For the first time in a very long while, those two parts of themselves were finally moving in the same direction, and somewhere deep inside they could feel that the journey back toward you had already begun long before a single word was ever spoken. As another sunrise quietly appeared, they realized something they had never allowed themselves to believe before. Returning to your life was no longer just an idea that visited their thoughts from time to time. It had become a decision that was slowly taking shape inside their heart. Yet the closer they came to that decision, the more they understood why they had stayed away for so long. It had never been because their feelings disappeared. It had always been because they feared arriving too late. Every passing day seemed to whisper the same question into their mind. What if they have already closed the door? What if they spent all this time waiting for me, and I never came? What if the silence I created became louder than every feeling I never had the courage to express? Those questions followed them everywhere. They carried them into crowded places where everyone else appeared carefree. They carried them into quiet evenings where there was nothing left to distract their thoughts. They even carried them into moments that should have brought happiness, only to realize that one unfinished chapter continued asking for their attention. The strange thing was that these thoughts no longer felt like emotional chaos. They felt like honesty finally catching up with them. For months they had believed they could simply move forward without looking back. They worked harder. They stayed busier. They convinced themselves that life was teaching them to let go. But now they understood that letting go and running away are not the same thing. Letting go brings peace. Running away leaves questions behind. And the questions they had buried had never truly disappeared. They had simply waited until the noise of everyday life became quiet enough to be heard again. That realization changed the way they looked at everything. They stopped blaming timing. They stopped blaming circumstances. They even stopped blaming themselves quite as harshly as before. Instead, they accepted that people sometimes need time to understand the value of what they already have. It is one of life's quietest lessons. We often recognize the importance of someone's presence only after their absence becomes part of our everyday routine. As painful as that truth felt, it also gave them clarity. They no longer wanted to waste another season pretending they had all the answers. They wanted to stop living inside assumptions and begin living inside honesty. Later that afternoon they found themselves sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold because they had been lost in thought for far too long. Without realizing it, they had been replaying one memory over and over again. It was not a dramatic goodbye or an unforgettable event. It was something so simple that anyone else would have forgotten it within hours. Yet for them it remained crystal clear. They remembered the way you looked at them while they were speaking, not interrupting, not judging, simply listening. Very few people had ever listened to them that way. Most conversations in life felt rushed, as though everyone was waiting for their turn to speak. With you, they had always felt heard. Looking back now, they realized how rare that feeling truly was. It was never about perfect words. It was about feeling understood without needing to explain every part of themselves. That memory alone reminded them why replacing this connection had never been possible. People often believe they miss a person's appearance or voice, but sometimes what they truly miss is the peace they felt in that person's presence. That was the part they had been searching for without even realizing it. As evening approached, another thought quietly entered their mind. They wondered if you had changed as much as they had. Time changes everyone in small ways. It teaches patience where there was once impatience. It replaces certainty with humility. It transforms old fears into quiet lessons. They imagined that perhaps you had grown stronger too. Perhaps you had learned to protect your peace. Perhaps you had stopped waiting for answers that never came. The possibility both comforted and frightened them. They wanted you to have found happiness, yet they could not ignore the hope that somewhere inside your heart there might still be room for one honest conversation. They knew they had no right to expect anything from you. Expectations were no longer guiding their thoughts. Gratitude was. Gratitude that life had introduced them to someone who showed them what genuine connection felt like. Gratitude that even after all this time, remembering you still brought warmth instead of bitterness. Gratitude that the memories carried kindness rather than regret. That gratitude slowly replaced the fear they had carried for so long. It reminded them that reaching out was no longer about trying to recreate the past. It was about respecting what had once been real. They understood that whatever happened next should be built on truth rather than nostalgia. They did not want to return pretending nothing had changed. They wanted to return as someone who had learned from every mistake, every silent night, and every unanswered question. As darkness settled once again, they opened the notes application on their phone and began typing words they never intended anyone else to read. It was not a message for you, at least not yet. It was a conversation with themselves. They wrote about the fear that had kept them quiet. They wrote about the moments they wished they could revisit. They admitted the things they had spent months denying. They confessed that the hardest part had never been losing contact. The hardest part had been pretending that losing contact did not affect them. By the time they finished writing, they noticed something unexpected. Their breathing had become lighter. The weight they had carried inside themselves no longer felt quite as heavy. Sometimes healing begins the moment a person stops arguing with the truth. They closed the notes, looked out at the quiet night, and smiled to themselves for the first time in a long while. Not because everything had been solved, but because they finally understood what the next step needed to be. They did not need the perfect words. They did not need the perfect timing. They only needed the courage to stop allowing fear to make decisions on behalf of their heart. The problem that once seemed impossible now looked different. It was no longer a wall standing in front of them. It had become a single step waiting to be taken. Deep inside they could already feel themselves moving toward that moment. They could not predict how you would respond. They could not control what tomorrow might bring. But they could choose who they wanted to become from this point forward. They chose honesty over hesitation. They chose sincerity over assumptions. And most importantly, they chose to believe that some connections deserve one final chance to speak before silence is allowed to write the ending. Somewhere within them, that decision had already been made, and although the world around them remained completely unaware, their heart had quietly begun preparing for the conversation it had been postponing for far too long. Every new sunrise now felt less like another ordinary day and more like one step closer to finally saying the words that had waited patiently inside them all this time, hoping that when the moment finally arrived, it would not be perfection that mattered most, but the simple courage to be completely honest at last. The following days unfolded with a quiet sense of anticipation they could no longer ignore. Nothing extraordinary happened on the surface. The world continued moving at its usual pace. People rushed through their routines, conversations came and went, and ordinary responsibilities demanded their attention. Yet beneath all of that, something inside them had changed so deeply that even the smallest moments carried a different meaning. They no longer woke up wondering whether they should stop thinking about you. That question had already been answered. Instead, they found themselves wondering how they could return without pretending that nothing had happened. The silence between you had lasted long enough to become part of both your lives, and they understood that silence leaves behind questions that simple words cannot erase overnight. That truth did not discourage them. If anything, it made them respect the connection even more. They knew that meaningful relationships are not repaired by perfect speeches or dramatic gestures. They are rebuilt through honesty, patience, and the willingness to accept responsibility for the moments when fear became louder than love. That realization stayed with them throughout every hour of the day. They noticed themselves becoming more thoughtful, more careful with the way they viewed people, and more aware of how easily misunderstandings can grow when no one chooses to speak first. Looking back, they could see countless moments where both of you may have been waiting for exactly the same thing without realizing it. They remembered times when they almost reached out but convinced themselves you probably did not want to hear from them. Now they wondered if perhaps you had been having similar thoughts all along. The possibility stayed with them because it reminded them how often people create distance with assumptions rather than reality. They had spent too much time imagining what you might think instead of giving you the opportunity to tell them yourself. That thought became impossible to ignore. For the first time, they understood that fear has a remarkable ability to write stories that are never actually true. It whispers that it is already too late. It insists that silence has already become permanent. It convinces people that protecting themselves is wiser than risking honesty. Yet every day they believed those whispers. Another day passed without knowing what might have happened if they had simply chosen courage instead. As evening approached, they walked through a familiar place that held no obvious connection to you, yet somehow your memory appeared once again. It was not because of a particular object or conversation. It was simply because the peaceful atmosphere reminded them of how they always felt after spending time with you. That calmness had become one of the things they missed most. Life had introduced them to many different people since then, but very few had brought the same quiet sense of understanding. They finally accepted that what they had been searching for all this time was never excitement or perfection. They had been searching for the comfort of feeling completely accepted without needing to become someone else. That realization filled them with both gratitude and sadness. Gratitude because they had experienced something genuine. Sadness because they had almost allowed fear to convince them that such a connection no longer mattered. They stopped walking for a moment and smiled to themselves, remembering how ordinary your best moments together had actually been. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic promises, no unforgettable spectacles. Instead, there were simple conversations that somehow stayed alive in their heart long after they ended. There were shared moments of laughter that appeared without effort. There were quiet pauses that never felt uncomfortable. Those memories reminded them that the strongest relationships are rarely built from extraordinary events. They are built from countless ordinary moments where two people gradually become a place of peace for one another. The more they reflected on this, the clearer everything became. They no longer wanted to return because they feared losing the past forever. They wanted to return because they believed genuine connections deserve honesty, even if the outcome remains uncertain. That change in perspective transformed the way they looked at the future. Instead of imagining impossible perfection, they imagined something much simpler. They imagined sitting across from you, speaking without pretending, listening without defending themselves, and allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. They accepted that some questions might not have immediate answers. Some emotions might still need time. Some wounds might still require patience. Yet none of those possibilities frightened them anymore because they finally understood that truth always creates stronger foundations than silence ever can. As the night grew quieter, they reached for their phone once more. This time they did not hesitate because of uncertainty. They hesitated because they wanted to make sure the next step came from sincerity rather than emotion alone. They realized there is an important difference between acting because feelings become overwhelming and acting because the heart has finally become clear. Their heart now felt clear. They were no longer trying to fill loneliness or escape regret. They were simply choosing honesty after spending far too long hiding behind hesitation. Before putting the phone back down, they whispered one quiet promise to themselves. Whatever happens next, I will no longer allow fear to decide the words that deserve to be spoken. That promise felt surprisingly peaceful. It reminded them that courage is not the absence of doubt. Courage is choosing truth even while doubt still exists. They closed their eyes for a moment and imagined the version of themselves they wanted to become from this day forward. Someone who speaks before silence creates unnecessary distance. Someone who listens before making assumptions. Someone who values genuine connection enough to protect it with honesty rather than pride. Those thoughts stayed with them long after the room had become completely quiet. Deep inside, they sensed that the journey back toward you was no longer something waiting in the future. It had already begun the moment they stopped running from their own heart. Every lesson, every sleepless night, every unanswered question, and every quiet realization had slowly guided them toward this point. The problem that once seemed impossible was beginning to lose its power because they finally understood its true nature. It was never the distance between you that mattered most. It was the fear that had grown inside the silence. And now that fear was becoming smaller with every passing day. They could not predict exactly when your paths might cross again or what words would be spoken when that moment arrived. But for the first time in a very long while, they no longer measured the future by uncertainty. They measured it by the quiet confidence growing inside their heart, the confidence that comes when someone finally stops hiding from the truth they have carried for far too long. Somewhere beneath all the unanswered questions, they knew one thing with complete certainty. If life offered another chance, they wanted that chance to be guided by honesty instead of hesitation, by understanding instead of assumptions, and by the simple courage to let the truth speak before silence had another opportunity to take its place.